Richard Reeves is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, where he holds the John C. and Nancy D. Whitehead Chair. And he's also just one of my heroes. Richard is one of these wonderful men who's able to, wonderful people who's able to work between in the interstices of policy, media, real thought leader in the world. Prior to coming to Brookings, Richard served in numerous thought leadership positions in the United Kingdom, including as director of the London-based think tank Demos, as principal policy advisor to the Minister for Welfare Reform in the government, as social affairs editor of The Observer, as research fellow at the Institute for Public Policy Research. This goes on, Richard, and they do want to hear. He's also a contributor to The Atlantic, National Affairs, Democracy Journal, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. Richard's publications at the Brookings Institution include the very provocative Dream Hoarders, How the American Middle Class is Leaving Everyone Else in the Dust, Why That is a Problem and What to Do About It. And of course, the book we've gathered to discuss tonight of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. I've had the pleasure of being able to work with Richard in one capacity or another for about a decade. And I think what makes him such a trusted advisor in the most important policy conversations happening in our country is that he asks very penetrating and sometimes uncomfortable questions. And then he really digs for the relevant data to guide him to conclusions that can increase fairness and opportunity for all. He's also a very conscientious husband and father, and I think you'll hear a little bit more about his fatherly concern as he makes his presentation this evening. We are so honored to have you with us. Please join me in a warm Brigham Young welcome for Richard V. Reeves. Good to be with you. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Wow, I was nervous before, but I'm really nervous now after that lead up. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I apologize in advance if my voice is starting to go. I've been talking about this book quite a lot recently, but I think I'll make it through this evening. I'd like to add my thanks to all of you for coming. And especially to those of you who have very, very busy lives in politics, in university administration, in the Church of the Latter-day Saints, etc. I am very, very grateful to see you. It's my first main visit. I've been here briefly before to the city, and I've had the chance today to speak to a number of people in various walks of life. And I think I can honestly say that as I look around, one of the things that's helping me feel less nervous is that I see people who I genuinely think of now as friends. After our engagement today. So thank you to all of you for coming and for the spirit of our engagement. As I think increasingly today, the spirit of engagement is so important. In some ways, or even more important than the content of that engagement is the way that we engage with each other. And today I've been genuinely honored and humbled by the nature of the engagement with me. Not despite the fact that there are some points of important disagreement between some of the people in the conversation, but I think because of that. It makes it even more important that we can engage with each other, and here Paul is something of a hero to me, that we do so with respect, we do so with open-mindedness, and we do so in the spirit of service. That we're all in the end seeking the same ends, which is a more flourishing society for all of us, our men, our women, our boys, and our girls. And it is in that spirit that I have engaged in the project I'm going to talk to you about today. I just want to apologize a little bit in advance because there are a few charts coming, and I'm very conscious that it's rather late in the evening for charts, but I'm a Brookings Institution scholar in the economic studies, and we don't go anywhere without charts. When my wife asks me how my day was, I get out charts. and ask her if she's referring to the median or the mean, and whether she wants a log scale or an arithmetic scale. Our evenings are, as you can imagine, they just fly by. So there are some charts coming, fair warning, but I'm going to skip through them pretty quickly and happy to go through them. But first of all, I want to explain really why I have written a book about boys and men, particularly at this moment. And there are some reasons for it, which are intellectual, but there are also some that are personal, because it's not as if I'm the first one to write about this subject. And this is just a smattering of books that have been written in the last few years. Hannah Rosen's book, The End of Men, which started as an Atlantic essay. Manning Up from Kay Heimowitz at the Manhattan Institute. Man Interrupted by Zimbardo and Cullum. Man Out by Andrew Yarrow, which was published by the Brookings Institution Press before mine. And The Boy Crisis by Warren Farrell and John Gray. So there are a number of books in this space, and I draw on all of these books and many more, but a reasonable question to ask if you're setting out on a book-length project, or indeed to read a book, is why this one, and why now? Why my time and your time on the book? I'm going to start by saying that there is an autobiographical element to this work. I have the view that all scholarship is at least partly autobiographical. It's just a question of whether we admit it to ourselves or not. Why are you studying that? Why are you so concerned about that? And usually there is at least some autobiographical reason for it. And in my case, it's very straightforward. I'm, as Paul's already alluded to, I'm the father of 3 boys. This is them back in the days when I was taller than them. So I choose this photo deliberately. This is not long after our move to Washington, D.C. at the end of, in 2012, 2013. I can't date it exactly. But you can see Cameron there on the left, George in the middle, and then Bryce on the right-hand side. Cameron on the left turns 21 now. It's his 21st birthday tomorrow. He'll be celebrating at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, where he's currently a sophomore. And so this picture was quite a long time ago. But as a father, now they're all in their 20s, having raised them on both sides of the Atlantic, I've really seen through their eyes some of the challenges of what it means to be a man today, and seeing them to negotiate in this new world. And so my dinner table conversations were very often about these issues, and then I would go into the office and I would be reading paper after paper about these issues, and that led me to want to write the book. Now, as I say in the preface of the book, as well as having raised my boys to adulthood and learning from them, honestly, as much as the other way around, about what it means to be a father and what it means to be a man in today's society, I also felt that things were worse than I'd expected as I looked at the data for boys and men. I had a sense that there were some challenges in the family, in the labor market, and education, but the more I looked, the bleaker the picture got. And I'm going to share some of those statistics with you in a moment. But I kept tripping over statistics and asking myself, wait, what? Really? And having someone check it. And realizing that some of these statistics weren't very well known. They weren't in the public debate, because by and large, it wasn't anybody's job to put them into the public debate. The second reason I was really interested in the subject was because if we look particularly at the challenges of men of certain groups, and especially men from working class backgrounds, less advantaged backgrounds, and black boys and men, you see even sharper signs of disadvantage. So whilst, of course, I'm very worried about my 3 boys, I started to become worried about millions of them, and especially those, frankly, who had fewer advantages than my own sons did. The third reason I wrote the book is because I kept running across policy interventions, and I'm a policy wonk by training, that were working much better for girls and women than they were for boys and men. So a free college program, for example, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, increased female college completion by 50%. It increased male college completion by 0, which meant that the ROI on that intervention was very, very negative. And so I went to Kalamazoo and talked to some of the young men, tried to figure out what was going on. And some of that you'll hear about in a moment. I also became convinced that many of the problems that are being faced by boys and men are not individual in nature, but structural in nature. They're about the structure of the education system, the labor market, and family life. But everywhere I turned, I heard people basically making an individualistic argument about what was wrong with boys and men. So the problems of boys and men were usually characterized as a problem with boys and men. Now, the way in which that occurred differed depending on the political inclinations of who was speaking. So from a conservative critic, for example, it might well be, well, they're just not masculine enough. They need to be more masculine, more of a breadwinner. They need to man up. They need to be more like their father. but it's about them. It's about their individual responsibility. And to be clear, I'm a big believer in individual responsibility, but we have to be honest about the structural constraints that people face. From the left, the problem was that they were too masculine. Perhaps they were toxic. And if we could just somehow exorcise out that nasty masculinity from them, they'd be okay. So if they weren't studying in school, it's because they were too lazy. If they were dying from COVID, it's because they didn't take care of their health, etc. But again, the emphasis was put on the individual, not on the structure. The next reason was because I felt that our political leaders in particular are failing spectacularly to engage properly with this discussion. And that for different reasons, both left and right are failing. For some of the reasons I've just alluded to, but more generally because each side is dug into a trench warfare style culture war, where if you give an inch, the other side will take a mile. And to put it very crudely, the left are turning their back on boys and men by refusing to acknowledge that there are even any problems here, or if they are, they're of boys and men's own making. But all too often, the response from the right has been to say, yeah, the problem is what's happened in the last 50 years, and especially the economic rise of women. And so we need to turn back the clock on women. And I have very, very little experience of people who actually believe either of those statements deep down. I think we want a world where women and men can flourish, and they can flourish together, shoulder to shoulder, with their differences. And then the last is I wanted to offer some solutions. I'm a policy wonk by training. I work at the Brookings Institution. And honestly, most of the books in this space so far have been secular equivalents of the Book of Lamentations. And lamentation books are really great to write. You spend 10 chapters of the books explaining in vivid detail how the world is going to hell in the handcart. And maybe you have a chapter 11 which says, oh, we better do something about it. I don't know, universal pre-K or something, ranked choice voting. That's for you. But I actually really wanted to be solutions forward, so I'm going to talk about that. And I want to move the debate on to what do we do about these problems once we've accepted that they exist. So with that, here come, with all due warning, a few charts. The first one on education. This chart shows you the trend in the gender gap in the acquisition of four-year degrees, which is the orange one, and master's or doctoral degrees, which is the blue one. The 100 line is the number of women for every 100 men who are getting one of these degrees, going back to 1971. 1972 was when Title IX was passed to encourage gender equality in education. The orange gap there shows you that at that time, men were about 13 percentage points more likely to get a four-year college degree than women. Women quickly caught up, as you can see. The line crosses the 100 mark in the 80s and has kept going, leveling out a little bit in recent years, such that now it's about 15 percentage points more likely that a woman will get a four-year college degree than a man. And the same pattern can be seen for postgraduate degrees, slightly later catch-up. The bottom line here is that the gender inequality in US higher education is wider today than in 1972 when Title IX was passed. It's just the other way around. And it's worth noting that nobody expected that. You can look back at the literature of the 1970s, and I've talked to many people involved in it. Nobody predicted that the lines would keep going. Nobody took seriously the fact that we might face a gender inequality running the other way around. And frankly, I think we're still coming to terms with it. I don't think we have the intellectual or institutional equipment yet to know exactly what to do with these numbers. And of course, in the 1970s, lots of organizations were created on behalf of women and girls in education, which continue to do excellent work to this day, but there are, of course, no equivalent organizations for boys and men. This shows you that some of what's happening in college is just a straightforward reflection of what's happening in high school. This shows you high school GPAs. These are all national data. And what we've done is we've ranked the GPAs from the lowest GPAs on the left-hand side to the highest GPAs on the right-hand side by decile. So we've just split the GPA distribution up into tenths and then said, what's the gender split? And so on the right-hand side, you can see that of those with the highest GPAs in US high schools, 2/3 of them are girls. And among those on the left-hand side, the lowest GPAs, 2/3 are boys, with a pretty linear relationship between the two. High school GPA is a great measure of and predictor of educational success generally. And of course, as more colleges go test optional, high school GPAs become even more predictive of college entrance than it was historically. And it is quite clear that in terms of high school GPA, the girls are leaving the boys in the dust. They've always been ahead to some extent, but now they're a long way ahead. Some of that reflects what happens even earlier. And this is a very busy chart, so I encourage you to look away. And just trust me when I say that what this chart shows you is that The gap between girls and boys in terms of their readiness to enter school in kindergarten, controlling for everything else, is wider than any other gap, including the race gap, the class gap, whether they went to pre-K gap, which is the 14% you see there. And so boys are on average much less likely to be ready for school in the first place. And this chart helps us explain how this plays out in adolescence. It's a chart from work that's been done by a bunch of the people working in adolescence. And adolescence is now understood to be a period of equal plasticity and importance to the early years, but neglected in public policy circles. And this is Larry Steinberg's work and others. And his book, The Age of Adolescence, has had a big influence on me. And what this does is it shows you across age, for girls on the left and boys on the right, the trend, the average trend, in two different forces. Impulse control is the blue line. Sensation seeking is the orange line. Psychologists like to refer to these as the psychological equivalent of the gas and the brake in the car. The sensation-seeking part of your brain is, yeah, go for it. Fantastic idea. Let's jump off that massive crane into that river. Sure, I'll try that drink. That looks fun, etc. Seek the sensation. Take risks, etc. Impulse control is like the brake in the car saying, no, 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 no. Put the brakes on. Don't do that. Look to the future. And so adolescence is a period of where you get a bit more gas and not quite enough brake. And so you can see even that for girls, there's a brief period where the gas is outrunning the brake, just very, very briefly here in kind of middle adolescence. But look at the boys. Adolescence is a period where the boys are all gas and almost no brake. And I've raised 3 boys. I know of what I speak. Some of you may have been boys yourselves. Some of you may know some boys and know that this is just basic biological fact. But it's not one that's reflected in our education system. And actually what this means more seriously for education is that the girls have developed their prefrontal cortex earlier than boys, and that's the bit of your brain that says you should turn your chemistry homework in. You should stay in and do your homework rather than going out and partying. And by the way, this GPA thing might matter. I remember trying to explain to Cameron, my youngest, what the A in GPA stood for after he managed to get a 1.7 GPA in his 9th grade and then struggled for the rest of his high school to try and drag it up. And I said, I told you, it's an A, it's an average. If you get 1.7 in 1 year, it's going to get very difficult to pull it up. By the way, 9th grade is really when boys just crater. So a modest proposal is, could we just ignore 9th grade grades altogether? Seriously, just take them out of the equation. But these biological and neurological differences are not reflected in the education system. So frankly, given this chart, it's amazing that the earlier charts aren't wider than they were. In a way, it's amazing that boys are doing as well, given that they are at this neurological disadvantage in the education system. Another reason why I think boys are struggling in our school system is because it's becoming an increasingly female environment. This is cross-sectional, but it shows you the particular elementary schools and middle schools' dominance of teachers who are female, and the number's dropping. In last year I looked, 24% of K-12 teachers were men. That's down from 33% in the 1980s. As you can see, only 1 in 10 elementary school teachers are male. And in early years education, which is a field that my middle son works in, there are almost no men. Only about 3% of early years educators are male, which, to put it in perspective, as a share of the profession, is half as many as there are women flying US military planes. Now, I'm not suggesting that 7% military jet pilots being women is high enough, but I'll say 2 things. One is I don't really care who's flying our fighter jets as long as they're the best people to shoot down the enemy should we get to that situation. But the second point I'll make is the US military is redesigning airplanes, changing the cockpits, changing the seats to be more inclusive so that more people, including more women, are able to do it. I don't see any equivalent attempts to redesign education to attract more men. And I would argue from a social welfare perspective that it is more important to have men in our kindergarten classes than it is to have women in our fighter jet cockpits. But the gap is huge. We need a massive recruitment effort there. On work, and I'll say a little bit here, but then focus a bit more on family, given the nature of the theme we're talking about today. There's been a massive transformation in the economic relationship between men and women. This is a base fact for my analysis, and I think what we should all think about. This shows you the wage distributions of men and women in 1979. So don't worry too much about exactly the numbers, it's adjusted for inflation, but what this is just telling you is that there was a big difference between the wages of women, these are all full-time workers, wages of women and the wages of men in 1979. In 1979, 13% of women earned more than the median man. So that's the bit, take the middle of the male distribution, how many women are to the right of that? It was 13%. And as you can see, a lot of work to do in terms of gender equality, in terms of wages. This is what happened by 2019. Now it's much harder to see the difference between the female and male wage distributions. They're not exactly the same, but they're dramatically closer, I think you'll all agree. And by 1979, 40% of women were earning more than the median man. And so there's huge overlap now between those distributions. This is a profound change in our society. When the economic relations between men and women have changed this quickly, that's a big deal. The other thing, of course, you can see is it's got squatter and push to the right. So in other words, the wage distributions of both men and women have also spread out. And this is an incredibly important point when it comes to class analysis. So this chart shows you, based back in 79, what's happened to the wages of these different groups. At the top are women in the 80th percentile of the female wage distribution. So they're a fifth of the way from the top of the female wage distribution. The one below them is median women. And then so the cross-hatched ones are the women. Then it's women at the 20th percentile, so a fifth of the way from the bottom, and then the same for men. So what you're seeing is that for men at the median, in the middle of the male distribution, and at the bottom, actually they've gone backwards in terms of wages, and it's only men at the top, the blue line, that have seen any increase at all. So men at the very top have seen similar wage gains to women at the bottom of the female wage distribution. Women at the top have just soared away. Again, from a different base, of course. But this is a way of unpacking the previous chart you saw. Again, these are profound, seismic changes in the economic structure of our society with consequences for family. And then also on wages, it's important to look at race. Again, 79 is the base year here, which is the blue dot, and then 2019, which is the orange arrow. And for white men, white women, black men, and black women, you can see what happened to their wages in that period. White men are still at the top and saw some wage gain, but nothing particularly huge. White women saw huge wage gains during that period, going way past black men, such that now for every dollar earned by a white woman, a black man earns 84 cents, with very little wage growth for black men, and pretty strong wage growth for black women, but not quite as strong as for white women. So again, we have to think beyond these clear binaries and look at how these things are intersecting, and then what does it mean for family formation within these different groups. But a key point here is, when someone talks about the gender pay gap, or the race pay gap, think of this chart. White women earn much, much more than black men. And Hispanic men, by the way. I'm now looking at the number of men in what I call HEAL jobs. HEAL jobs stand for health, education, administration, and literacy. It's like the antonym of STEM, which most of you have probably heard of. And we've had huge efforts to get women into STEM jobs, which I applaud, and been very successful, but nothing to get men into HEAL jobs, even though we're creating jobs in these sectors very rapidly. In fact, they've become more female-dominated. This is the percentage of men in these different professions. Psychologists at the top, then social workers and elementary school and middle school teachers, and then nurses. You can see that these professions, actually, the top three anyway, were pretty close to gender parity back in the 80s, 40, 60% male, and that they've cratered in terms of male representation. And as we go forward, things get even worse. Among psychologists under the age of 30, only 5% are male. So if you think that men have mental health problems, and that that's a possibility, which I do, and you think that some men might want a male therapist, which I did when I sought out therapy, that's going to get increasingly hard because there are just so few men in those professions. Nursing has gone up a little bit in terms of male representation. An important note there is a huge amount of that is immigration driven. Many of the male nurses have actually come from other countries. This is a chart that I found from psychologists Rong Su and James Rounds. And I think this is interesting in itself, but also it's interesting when we talk about sex differences and how much they matter in our current society, which is a very politically sensitive topic. What they did was they said, let's take the personality profiles of men and women across the whole population. And we know that on average, men are a bit more into things and women are a bit more into people. The people-things distinction is quite well known in psychology. So the stereotype is the guy's in the garage tinkering with the car on his own. the wife is inside having coffee with her friend. It's a stereotype, but it captures a little bit of truth. Men are a bit more thingy, and women are a bit more people-y, if you like. And so, okay, that's true on average. Imagine if people were selecting into occupations based on those natural differences, and that's the orange line. And so, for example, on the left-hand side, the orange line would predict, based on the personality differences between men and women, that about 30% of engineers would be women. And over on the right-hand side, medical services, which includes nursing, that's the biggest profession in there, we would see about 60% of those would be women. It also includes doctors, I think. So it's broader than that. But that whole sector would be about 60%. And then the blue lines show what the actual share of women in those occupations is. And you'll see that in the middle, it's a pretty good match. So it suggests that the labour market's sorting in a way that's kind of allowing some real choice here, substantive choice. But there are some areas where that's not true. Like engineering can go a lot further before we could feel pretty confident that actually we'd reach some sort of ceiling. And I do think that people on both sides of the political divide can get this wrong. On the right, people will say, well, of course only 12, 15% of engineers are women. What do you expect? Their brains are different. They're not as into things as men. And on the left, what you might see is until we get to 50%, then we won't have rid ourselves of patriarchy. The truth is the distributions overlap, and that we should look and see when do we feel reasonably comfortable that people are able to make these choices. And when I see 5%, I'm not happy. The same arguments were made about women in politics not so very long ago. Is that just weren't equipped for it. And so I'm very, very, very nervous about the way biological differences that occur on average can be turned against the cause of gender equality. But I'm also very, very nervous about assuming that in order to show we've got gender equality, we have to have 50-50 in absolutely everything, which just defies human nature, in my view. There's a middle ground here, as so often. And then in terms of family, which is my third area, we've seen a significant rise. You'd expect to see this given the trends I showed in the labour market earlier. This shows you, again, all of these are based back in 1970, that among dual earner couples, what percentage of women earn more than their spouses? And it's got to about 30% now. This is those who are more educated than their spouses. That's actually now gone up quite a bit since. This is the percentage of households in which women are the sole or primary breadwinner, which is 40%. So among all US households now, 40% of them have a sole or female or primary breadwinner, female. And this is the labour force participation of women with children under the age of 6, all since 1970. Now, again, if you think about the wage charts I showed earlier, these are profound social changes. The central goal of the women's movement in the 1970s was to secure economic independence for women, thereby making marriage a choice. And I think that has been spectacularly achieved in recent decades. And I think it is one of the most wonderful liberations in our history. But it has come with profound consequences, not least for men. And it is our responsibility, even when there are positive social changes, to take seriously the second-round effects on other groups. And I think to just either imagine that these trends don't have profound implications for what it means to be a father, to be a man in modern society, when we've defined it so clearly previously, is naive in the extreme. But I think it is equally naive to think that there is some way in which these lines can be magically reversed back to the way they were before, even if anybody wanted it, which I don't. I hear you say, what about the gender pay gap? Well, the gender pay gap is a parenting pay gap. This is data, this is actually Scandinavian data, but it's the same in the US, and I've realized that I should have used the US data. What this shows you on the left-hand side is women at the top who don't have children, and then the women at the bottom who do have children. And then over the right, you can see the men who have children and the men who don't have children. And if you're looking for a difference on the right, you won't see one, really. Children have no effect on men's earnings trajectories, but children have a massive effect on women's earnings trajectories, because women take time out of the labour market to look after their kids. And in my view, that's largely a substantive choice that women are making now. I think we've got to a point where we have to respect that as a choice, but it does have serious consequences for the gender pay gap. So what's driving the gender pay gap? Parenting. It's a parenting pay gap. It's not discrimination. It's a difference between the gender patterns of childcare. And then, of course, there's the question of births outside of marriage. This is child trends data. Compares 1990 to 2016. You can go back further and get more dramatic trends, but I quite like this data series. And what it just shows you is, based on these different education levels, what percentage of the births were occurring to unmarried women in those years. Let's start on the right, because we're in a highly educated audience. Those with a bachelor's degree or higher. It was 5% in 1990. It's doubled to 10%. So it's doubled, but from a much lower base, and remains much lower than for other groups. As you can see, for those with some college or an associate's degree, it's now 43%, 59%, and then 62%. These groups are, the bottom left, the group on the left is becoming smaller, of course, over time, but nonetheless, you can see this huge education gradient. Most of the children born to non-college educated women now in the US are born outside marriage. 40% of all children are born outside marriage. Again, profound social and economic changes. And we have to stare them in the face. Lastly, I'm going to offer some solutions. And I'm going to give one line on each one with apologies. There is more in the book. The book risks being a bit wonky in places. My wife read one section of the book, and we were talking about it over dinner. Again, these are the kind of dinners we have in our house. And she said, she's reading out her comments on a bit of the book, and she said, painfully wonky, difficult to understand, does not add value. And my middle son looked up from his phone and said, are you talking about Dad again? Oh, how we laughed. I think I have taken that particular passage out, but I was very pleased when Matthew Iglesias described my book as earnest, bordering on banal. That's what I was going for. I'm not going to put that on the paperback edition, by the way, but I do think some of these issues just need some straightforward policy solutions, and I have some in mind. We should start boys in school a year later than girls. They just develop slower. Let's accept that fact, and by default, enroll them a year later. Redshirt them all. We should have done it with our middle son. We half did it. Really, really messed up. I would like to see us have 1,000 new technical high schools across the US. That would double the number of students with access to them to about 15%. Maybe still not high enough, but pretty good. If the federal government put about $5 billion a year behind that, that should be enough to make that happen, which is approximately 1% of the cost of cancelling student debt. That feels like a good deal to me. If I can spend 1% as much as cancelling student debt and get 1,000 new technical high schools, yep, I'll do that. 1 million more apprenticeships. Sadly, the apprenticeship bill is stalled in the Senate for reasons that are too exasperating to go into. But for a very small amount of money, we could create 1 million new apprenticeships. And I should say, by the way, both of these policies will help men and boys disproportionately by massive margins. That is not a bad thing. It is a good thing, and we should say as much. A mass recruitment drive of male teachers. Subsidies, scholarships, hiring bonuses, throw money at it, throw social media at it. We cannot allow the teaching profession to become steadily more female and not do anything about it. It is, frankly, immoral, in my view, that we're not even having the conversation about this. And I say especially in English because it turns out that male English teachers have the biggest effect on male performance. But what's the subject that men are least likely to be teaching? English. So how about some targeted subsidies for men to teach English in our middle schools, especially, and high schools? Let's throw money at it. Male-only scholarships to get men into those professions, in just the same way that we've had female-only scholarships to help women get into STEM jobs, which I fully support. Subsidies for men entering HEAL training jobs, the HEAL ones I've talked about, same thing, subsidies, scholarships. That's where a lot of the jobs of the future are coming from. The gender segregation of the labour market's gone just one way. We desperately need more men in our classrooms, but also in our hospitals, and as care workers, and as social workers, and as counsellors. It is wrong that most people seeking substance abuse counselling are male, but most substance abuse counsellors are female. It can't be right that most special needs kids are male, but most special needs counsellors are female. There's just a huge mismatch between the users of many of these services and the providers. And I would argue for equal independent paid leave for mothers and fathers. Fatherhood needs to be established as an independent social institution. This is where not everyone agrees with me. I think a father-first policy is the way to go, given the trends we've seen in marriage and the economic independence of women. The message we need to send to our men, our young men, our women, is dads matter, period. fathers matter, and they especially matter in adolescence. They seem to have a particular value add in adolescence. Women maybe have a bit more value add in the early years, men in adolescence. Fathers matter, and that means I think use it. We should have paid leave that the fathers have to take. That's not transferable. I suspect that will lead to more marriage, because I think marriage is increasingly about parenting rather than economic dependence. I don't know, but I think we need a father-first policy that may lead to marriage rather than the other way around. Because I think that the old traditional version of marriage has been so altered by social and economic changes that we should not be putting our eggs in that basket anymore. And I'm happy to take questions on that, of course. And unmarried fathers get treated quite badly by the current legal system. Divorced fathers do better, but unmarried fathers in many states in the US are not treated very well. The presumed situation to kids born to unmarried mothers is sole custody to the mother. For understandable reasons, the father has to prove paternity, it's assumed in marriage, go to court, etc. And too many of our child support systems treat unmarried fathers like walking ATMs. And it is not that they shouldn't contribute to their kids, they should, but they also, as fathers, have relational rights with their kids. And whereas for married parents, we have quite a good system of handling that through the divorce courts, the way we handle the unmarried situation is not very good at all, because we're not willing to confront the trends I outlined earlier. And with that, I will finish, except for some blatant self-promotion. I don't know if you've heard, but I have a book called Of Boys and Men, available in Kindle edition, also as an audio book, which I read myself, and then I nearly did lose my voice then as well. I had to audition for the part of myself, which would have been really troubling if I hadn't gotten the part. And they said, oh, would you get some unemployed British actor to read it? I said, it's my book. Anyway, I successfully auditioned for the part of Richard Reeves, read it, and here are some of the other things I'm engaged in, Twitter, dialogues, etc. And I'd very much appreciate your questions and challenges, and thank you again for the opportunity to share my ideas with you this evening. No.
Okay, we are going to take some questions here
Great.
for you.
Yes.
And we have a microphone over here. As people are thinking about their own questions, let me just probe a little bit more, Richard, on the differential advantages of parenting styles or approaches between men and women and in different stages of the children's lives. Say just a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I'm convinced, is Kevin Schaefer in the audience? I know we met earlier. Yes, okay, thank you, Kevin. I've been influenced by Kevin Schaefer's forthcoming book, Comparative Study of Fatherhood in the US and Canada on this, which I can't recommend highly enough. But it also has a very good summary of the evidence that fathers do matter in ways that are distinct to but complementary to that of mothers. So I think it nails the lie that we don't need dads very convincingly. But it also turns out that that does slightly vary by life stage. And again, this is not something that I'm going to say that Kevin has said, but my interpretation of the data is that the evidence for the effectiveness of fathers is especially strong in adolescence. It does look as if those years are years in which dads really kind of come into their own. And Anna Machin's book, The Life of Dad, makes a similar argument, whereas in the very early years, it does look as if mums might have something of a competitive advantage. And so the soundbite is tots for mums, teens for dads, and it will all come out in the wash.
Okay. Your questions. We have a microphone here. Is it roving or is it going to be right over there? And give us your name.
On what is based the theoretical curve, and why do you believe it? For instance, engineering.
Yes.
Why is theory saying it should be 30%?
Because one of the differences in personality traits between men and women is that, on average, men are somewhat more interested in things, thinginess as opposed to relationships. And to the extent that being more into things predicts wanting to be in engineering, which it seems like it does, the fact that there are more men with that personality profile would suggest that everything else equal, more men will be in that profession, under conditions of substantive free choice. But 30% is a lot higher than 15%, which is where we are now. And so what I'm using that chart to do is some normative work for me, which is on the one hand, there are people who can take any number, however low it is, and say, you see, that's because of these biological differences between men and women. And other people won't stop until it's 50. So I remember in the 1980s in the UK, people saying it's true that only 5% of our members of parliament are women, but women aren't really interested in leadership and politics. It's not really in their, it's not their thing. This is even after Margaret Thatcher, when we'd have thought we'd have nailed that lie with Margaret Thatcher. And now it's a third of British members of parliament are women. So imagine if we'd stopped then. Now, we may not get to 50. So that's the point of the chart, is just to show that we should be okay with differences, but we should be suspicious in any field if the number is really, really low, with the exception, one exception, with the exception of very dangerous or uncomfortable work. And so deep sea fishing, for example, has there are almost no women in deep sea fishing, but based on a non-representative sample of my female colleagues, they're quite happy to let us keep that one.
Brent, did you want to
Just a quick
that?
follow-up. I appreciate that. Are there other factors that could have been considered besides thinginess versus people? I mean, is that the only dimension in which men and women differ,
No.
which drives a theoretical curve?
No, it's the one that they looked at, and then they tried to look at occupations where they thought that would be most relevant. So they looked at the kind of people-y and most thingy kind of occupations, and then you saw a selection up there. But you can easily imagine a different thing. For example, on average, women are a bit more agreeable than men. Again, on average, I'm actually quite agreeable. I hope you'll all agree. And I know some quite disagreeable women. But on average, women are more agreeable than men. And so if there is a profession, and I know lots of disagreeable men, if there's a profession where agreeableness is important, you would expect there on average to be more women. So that chart could be done as well for, say, service sector jobs, for example. Like in a service sector job where agreeableness is a good personality trait, everything else equal, you'd expect there to be more men than women in it, but you wouldn't expect it to be 98% women. It's not that only 2% of men are agreeable. It's just that maybe only 30% of men are agreeable. In this crowd, of course, it's 100%.
We have a question back here.
Yeah, hi. My name is Katrina. My question's kind of long, so let me...
Okay.
But we do want a question, not a statement. So.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm not. My question is, when I went to BYU, I first started studying art, and I saw a huge difference between like the art programs and the animation programs. This is just an example. Mm-hmm. Because in the art programs, it wasn't leading to maybe like a direct job, or it could be in the animation programs, there's places you can go directly to work, and it's outside of the home. And because I have a kid, I know that the hard thing is to have a kid and work, but since right now we're living in a world where things go online, now I'm wondering how big of an effect do you think that will have, because then we could bring maybe some of those jobs that used to be outside of the home in the home.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And I think it has the potential to achieve something which we've long needed, which is to create much more family-friendly work. And so we've always been promised family-friendly work, but what we often try and create is work-friendly families. I.e., I need to drop my kid off at school early so I can get to work on time, and I need after-school care so I can get home. So what we've basically done is we've tried to bend children's lives to the old model of work, which was the one that men used to do when there were women at home raising the kids. And so I think that the pandemic has the real opportunity, if we are able to do more of this stuff online, for sure. And you're seeing a lot of women, in particular, choosing those options, but also a lot of men. And there is some evidence that fathers changed their working patterns more than mothers did during the pandemic. And so I'm quite hopeful that both mothers and fathers will be able to seize the opportunity to construct work that is more compatible with family life. One of the reasons we don't see enough women in professions like law, finance, is because they're not just not family friendly, they're family hostile professions. It's basically impossible to do those jobs well and raise kids at the same time. And so women just, if the women want to raise their kids, they can't make it through those professions. So those professions are, as I said, actively family hostile.
Hi, my name's Joseph Addington. One of the things that I'm really interested in is housing policy, and I know that especially for younger generations, housing costs have been skyrocketing. And I know several families that would like to have children but aren't able to because they don't feel like they're in a situation where housing is economically feasible for them to start a family. What do you think, like, the effects of that would be, considering, you know, the issues that are facing families, especially fathers today?
Well, I'll make a data point first, which is that young women are more likely to be buying a house than young men. Yeah, if they're on their own. Single young women much more likely to buy a house, and single young men much more likely to be living at home with their parents than young women. So to the extent that someone's out there buying houses, getting on the housing ladder, if they're not doing it with a partner, it's women, not men. Or more women than men, I should say. It's a huge problem for US society generally. And I know that there are some senior politicians who are very worried about fertility and having more children, and one of the, and bringing down artificial barriers to forming families and maybe forming them earlier so that there is more time for childbearing. The housing market's a big one of them. But that's the fault of, in my view, hoarding local zoning ordinances, a massive failure on the supply side of the US housing market. I think to call the US housing market a market is being generous. It's so badly rigged and distorted in favor of those of us with money and power that it's a class and a generational thing. And so we need much more supply. We need much less regulation of land use in the US.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Yeah, I'm Allison Watkins Dean, and I was wondering, do you believe that a lot of the influence that would come from more men in heel occupations would lend to the role models needed? Do you think that that's the biggest problem that boys and men are facing now, is the lack of role models?
Well, one of the great mantras of the women's movement was you have to see it to be it. And so I do think that the kind of knock-on effects of completely feminizing a lot of these occupations is to make it harder for boys to see those as professions for them. And so then it becomes a vicious cycle. I was driving home with one of my sons. I have this in the book. He'd just seen the doctor, and he said to me in the car, he said, "Dad, I didn't know that men could be doctors." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, that doctor was a man. And I was like, "Yes." He said, "I didn't know that." And I just thought for a minute, I realized every doctor he'd seen up until that point had happened to be a woman. Not happened to be, because pediatrics is female-oriented now, but it just is a reminder that kids just believe their eyes and not their ears. And so I said, yeah, actually, men can be doctors. In fact, your uncle is a doctor. He'd be upset that you said this. But also they can be nurses. So I think that role modeling is important. I think a more general point is, I think one of the reasons that people are so concerned about having more male teachers is because they don't see very many other environments where they are seeing male role models. Some of us have been talking a bit about the Boy Scouts today. I think it was a profound error for them to go co-ed. We're seeing fewer and fewer male-only spaces, and I think that creates this demand, which we're trying to meet through the school system. So I think we've got to do both. We do need more male teachers, because absolutely that will create role models, and male teachers are more likely to be coaches. So if we have fewer male teachers, we also have fewer coaches. But also we need more male scout leaders. We need more men in just those other male spaces. We need men in church leadership positions. Like, we need lots of opportunities for men to be needed. A fundamental human need is to be needed. And if our men and our young boys don't feel needed, then it's no wonder that so many of them are going off the rails. So yeah, I want to send a signal to young boys and men. These are professions that they could do as well, but also I want them to see men doing these jobs as men. And I think that's incredibly important going forward. And so, as I said, I just can't see the lines going the way they're going, and no one acting, and not be a little bit horrified. If we saw another profession going the other way, becoming increasingly male-dominated, and it was one we cared about, like politics or something, we'd be talking about it, quite rightly. Who's talking about what's happening in K-12 education? Where have all the men gone? Answer, almost nobody. Because there's no one whose job it is to talk about it.
A question here, and then I have two others over here, and that might be about it. So let's get this.
My name's Preston Jenkins. I mean, piggybacking off of your comments just there, a lot of us are students in this audience, and we're about to dive into the professional field. And so to the point of the solutions that you proposed, what professional deficit do we need to fill for that solution to be realized.
Can you say just one sentence more about, I don't quite grasping at it.
Sure. So you've seen a lot across the world, and from your research and whatnot, I'm just wondering, like, what professional deficits can we as students fill to help reach those ends?
Yes. Okay. Well, I think some of the areas that I mentioned, I think it is. I mean, in psychology, it's at crisis point already. I think in elementary school teaching, middle school teaching, it's approaching crisis point. Social work's not far behind. And so, I mean, I can't tell you how happy I am that one of my sons is like early years teacher and wants to go on to be a teacher, because there just are so few of his peers that would even consider that. And so I think to the extent that if we care about what's happening to our boys and men, and we think there are ways in either for our professional or personal life we can help fill those gaps, then I think it's incumbent on us to do so. And I think it's especially incumbent on men to do so. It's why I became a scout leader. Came up through the Boy Scouts. It was hugely important to me. And at the risk of offending everybody, our local scout group was being run by 2 women who were great, but there were mums who stepped in because no one else would do it. And I looked at what they were doing and said, no. And stepped in because I thought it was really important to have both female and male leaders. And so I really just encourage anybody in your position, in whatever, to step up, to not think that to create a world where women can flourish, that we in any way need to be less than, not to flourish, not to reach out, not to be ambitious. So I've talked a lot today to church leaders about the importance of missionary work and being of service. And I think that service ethic is one that we're seeing right now more strongly among women than among men. Women who become mothers and know that they have to look after their kids. Women who volunteer, twice as likely to volunteer as men now. And so actually full-time employed single mums spend more time volunteering than unemployed single men. What's going on there? And so actually I think the ethos of service more generally is one that we could do through our professions, but should be something that we should take more seriously in our personal lives too.
Right here.
So, piggybacking off the question that was asked a couple times, the young lady over there, do you think that that there's a decreasing interest in young men in recreational reading, as well as do you think that there might be an effect from less reading of classics in earlier literature, like in high school and middle school? For example, when this semester I became interested, so I checked out Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which is a Stoicism thing. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, this would be really cool if I read this in high school. Yeah. And lo and behold, like a few generations ago, it was read in high school. Yes. So I just wonder if that's has an effect, or what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I just think don't think everyone should have to read that. I really do. I don't know enough to have very clear views about this, but I will say that the importance of reading at length and occupying those different imaginary worlds is incredibly important for both boys and girls. I'm a bit worried more generally that social media has reduced the attention spans of boys and girls, frankly. But I think particularly in areas like literature, it looks like the skills you develop through that, these verbal skills, more of the people-y things, to come back to this other earlier question, English really helps with the development of those skills, those softer skills, if you like, which is one reason why I think it might be helpful for more men to be teaching those sorts of subjects. And yes, in ways that are classical. It's not like people didn't know stuff before. It's not like some of the ancient texts don't have some really good stuff to say. I mean, basically, Jordan Peterson just says what Marcus Aurelius says in a different way, and has made millions doing so. I wish I'd thought of it. So it's hugely important. But again, to emphasize this point about English teachers, like to be anecdotal for a moment, my English teacher in high school taught us metaphysical poetry from John Donne, Andrew Marvell, including To a Coy Mistress and some amazing romantic poetry. He was a Korean War veteran who also was a bus driver. And he would have us in tears reading metaphysical poetry. I don't think that would have happened if it wasn't a man, for me, just for me. I think the fact of a man teaching me to love and write and read poetry was hugely important. And I think that's, and it's also important for women to teach subjects maybe the other way around. But I look back on Mr. Wyatt, who was my teacher, taught me to love poetry, and I think the fact that he was who he was helped me to read. He's a bunch of working class, unruly 16-year-old boys. You're going to get them to read John Donne and Andrew Marvell? By God, he did.
And I think this will be our final student question.
I hope it's about marriage.
Actually, not for myself, but on this campus there is a market you haven't addressed, and I was wondering how this affects the dating market.
Online or in real life?
Let's say real life, because there's 30,000 students on campus and they can figure it out.
Well, there is some concern about if you do get very unequal, you don't have it here, of course, but very unequal sex ratios on campuses, it seems to have an effect on behavior on those campuses. It's one of the reasons why admissions officers really, really worry about breaking through certain points. It seems as if you get much past 60-40, female, male, first of all, application rates drop generally, but also it changes the dating market on the campus because you have, assuming straight, you have a deficit of men and a surplus of women. And I don't think it's controversial to say that those are circumstances in which that don't bring out the best in men. And what we're seeing is that playing out both in real life on college campuses, but also in some dating apps, etc., which is as this imbalance grows between, say, the number of college-educated or on college campuses, etc., between women and men, that asymmetry can create all kinds of problems, and a lot of women in particular are finding it rather difficult. And so, crudely put, if the guys have more power in the dating market, that doesn't end up very well for the women because of the competition that it creates, and that can lead to some quite bad behavior on the part of the men. And what we particularly see is that the men with the highest status, this is even more true online than in real life, that the men with the highest status and the ones who are the most attractive overall, they can end up, what's the polite way to put this, over-consuming if we're not careful, because naturally, of course, people are going to want someone higher status. Women may want that even a little bit more than men. And so there's this kind of gravitational pull, and that can lead to behavior. I'm very worried about what's happening to the online dating markets have basically become a kind of Genghis Khan situation, where a kind of few men at the top are just huge numbers of interest. But I think that's one of the challenge. The cultural task before us is a new script for masculinity. And that new script will contain the best of the old script, which is about self-mastery and autonomy, etc., and interest in forming stable families and mating and having children, etc. But that script won't write itself. And right now, I think one of the other things that's causing some young men to be dislocated or withdrawn or act out or check out, which I'm much more worried about, frankly, is because we've torn up the old script, we haven't replaced it. They're left reeling. They don't know where to turn. And that does not turn out to be good for women either. And so I think we're all engaged in that task right now, but we've barely begun the task of what it means to be a man in a world of much greater gender equality. Look at the numbers here in terms of girls enrolling and graduating, and just multiply that across the nation. And so it's happened so fast, honestly, and conservatives warned that we'd have to get ready for this. They were right about that. They were wrong to say we should stop it happening, but they were right to say if we fundamentally change the nature of the economic relationship between men and women, then big questions are going to be asked about what it means to be a man today. And if we don't address that problem, other people will. It is an axiom of political and cultural life that if real problems are not addressed by responsible people, irresponsible people will exploit them. And it's one of the things that's, I think, is metastasized into grievance politics, which is damaging our politics more generally, and I think damaging our culture because we're just not being grown up about the fact that we have real problems and that we should address them in ways that in no way undermine the push towards gender equality, but also do not bench our men and make them feel that they are not needed anymore. The last thing I'll say, as a sober note to end on, but I think appropriately, a study of men who commit suicide looked at the last words they used to describe themselves before they did so. And the two words most commonly used by those men were useless and worthless. As I said a moment ago, it is a fundamental human need to be needed. If we make our men feel that they're not still needed by our society, by our culture, it is small wonder that so many of them are suffering so much, and sometimes with those tragic consequences. So this is no small task, but it couldn't be more important, and I'm incredibly grateful to share the opportunity with you to talk about it.
Please join me in thanking Richard Reeves.